Hello, I'm Jamie Norman, and my chosen pericope for this assignment is Habakkuk 3, which I've come to understand as a song of prayer and praise to Almighty God. Habakkuk is a dialogue between God and the prophet, and as the prophet dialogues with God, he learns of the nature of God. And as he learns of the nature of God, he begins to see God in many different ways. And then ultimately, it erupts in chapter number 3 in a song, a plea for mercy, and a song of rejoicing in God, which deals with, introduces, summarizes Habakkuk's understanding of who God is. Habakkuk chapter 3 is introduced to us as a prayer, and there doesn't need to be a great deal of analysis there because the first verse comes right out and tells us that this is a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet. But it is more than a prayer, and that is given to us through the phrase upon or according to Shigianoth, which is a musical term. It's used in Psalm 7, although translated slightly differently, as a song that is sang by David. And then you have verse 3 that uses the musical term Selah. That musical term also appears in verse number 13. And then the last line of Habakkuk chapter 3 says that this is to the choir master, and it should be accompanied with stringed instruments. And so this prayer is also a song or a psalm. What the prayer of the song is about is found in verse number 2, and that is a prayer that God would remember mercy. And this introduces to us, gives us some hints on what Habakkuk has come to understand about the nature of God, that he would pray for mercy. And we're going to see some hints at some structural devices within the psalm, and then some exposition on the nature of God in the following verses. First, Habakkuk reports that he has heard the report of God, and it has caused him to tremble in fear. And so that's what he understands about the nature of God, is he's fearful. He should be afraid. Habakkuk chapter 3 mentions the divine name 5 times, which could be significant because it could hint to us of a structural device. The divine name appears twice at the beginning, once in the middle, and twice at the end. There are shifts in first, second, and third person references to God. All of these can tell us several things, but the main thing is that this plea for mercy in this prayerful song has at its heart, through the usage of the divine name and the personal references to God, it has at its heart the nature of God. Second, the prophet prays for mercy in the midst of the years, which gives us a perfect platform for the historical context, which is a transition between the Assyrian dominance of the world to the Babylonian dominance of the world. The Babylonians had not yet taken over. The prophet refers to the Babylonians by their old name, the Chaldeans, which may give us a hint that the Babylonians had not yet come to be understood as the threat in world dominance as they would come to be understood when they are known to be the Babylonians. at this time, the sins of Judah had become grievous, and this causes the prophet to ask God why the sins of Judah had gone unpunished. God responds and says he will punish Judah, and he'll use the Chaldeans to do so, which gives rise to another question and complaint from Habakkuk, which is, how could you allow a wicked nation to punish your people? And then God answers that by saying, I will punish the wicked nation as well. And this theodicy, this weighing of God's goodness against God's righteousness, just continues to reveal God's nature to Habakkuk, and then, of course, to the hearer of the oracle and to the modern reader. And it is through this questioning and dialogue that Habakkuk learns about the nature of God, which would give him cause to fear, but also cause to pray, to rejoice, and plead for mercy. Habakkuk 3 through 15 shows us the praise of the prophet for God's power. Verses 3 and 4 shows us a theophany where God appears on behalf of his people. It says that God comes from Mount Teman. He came from Mount Paran, which are regional references, both of these being south of the Dead Sea, and could be referencing the Exodus saga, where God brings his people up out of the south. And that is made more plausible by the fact that pestilence and plague is mentioned, which are all part of the Exodus saga. And there even is a reference to the fact that the sun stands still, which could be a part of the time of conquest in the time of Joshua. And that would obviously hold great significance to the people of God, to Judah, as a word of hope, reminding them that although God is terrible and awesome, that he has also brought them up as his own people. There seems to be a variance that may hold some significance in translations. In verse 4, the King James Version shows horns coming out of the hands of God, while the English Standard Version and the New American Standard Bible show rays of light flashing from God's hand. This is the rays of light, or the bolts of lightning, is probably the best way to understand this text. And given that understanding, Pinker takes the rays of light and then the glittering of the spear that's mentioned in verse 11 of Habakkuk chapter 3 as being some forms of communication on the battlefield, which upholds the victorious warrior motif that we see of God in Habakkuk chapter 3. Habakkuk 3, 5 through 7, and then 10 and 11 show us creation's response to God's power. It begins with a reference to the pestilence and plague, which is, of course, a creational response, and could be a reference, as was stated before, to the Exodus saga. We also have a creational response that seems to come in the form of an earthquake. Midian trembles, the earth is split with rivers, the mountains writhe at the power of Almighty God. This could be a reference to a historical earthquake that actually happened. In my mind, it could be a reference to the days of the flood. But whatever the case, it shows the nature of God as mighty and powerful, and it causes the prophet to tremble. Verses 12 through 15 of Habakkuk chapter 3 show the battle and victory of God. And so whether the creational response is a are historical acts, things that have actually happened, or they are just general references to the awesome power of Almighty God. Whatever the case is there, several of the scholars that I researched for this assignment seem to think that Habakkuk could be using some of the ancient Near East creation myths that have God or the gods pitted against chaos in a cosmic battle that results in creation, ultimately, where creation is brought to order. Also, all of those myths contain some form of water, and water is explicitly mentioned in Habakkuk 3 in verses 8 through 10 and verse 15. I'm not sure I agree with the adaptation of the ancient Near Eastern myths. However, it does show God or reveal God as a victorious warrior, regardless of where one stands on that. God is victorious in battle, and it's made plain in verses 12 through 15, especially in verse 13, where God is said to fight for the salvation of his people, and he crushes the head of the wicked. And so we have in learning of the nature of God, we have God who is sovereign over all creation, who wins the cosmic battle, if you choose to believe that. And then he is fighting for the salvation of his people. So we have this terrible God, yet interested in the salvation of his people. And so we can begin to understand why Habakkuk rejoices in this God and has the courage to cry out for mercy from Almighty God. Which leads us to 16 through 19 of Habakkuk chapter 3, which reveals the unwavering faith of Habakkuk. Habakkuk 3:16 shows Habakkuk's response to God's power. He is a part of creation, and he responds similarly as creation, in that he trembles along with creation. However, he still knows enough about God that he retains the resolve that he exhibits in verse 2 and states that he will trust in God's mercy and goodness, even though God is terrible and fearful. He says that he believes God will do as he said he would, because Habakkuk mentions or states explicitly that he will wait. Though it tarries, he trusts in God that God will do as he says with his people and with the Chaldeans. Then verse 17 through 19 of Habakkuk 3 shows us Habakkuk rejoicing in God's power, which shows us that the theological questions have been answered, or at least settled in the heart of Habakkuk, and he will rejoice in the power of God. So we have the prophet who has learned of the nature of God. He is fearful, but he still rejoices in God, because God will exhibit mercy. He will, in the midst of terrible wrath, remember mercy. Which causes the prophet to say, regardless of life circumstances, if the farm fails, if the figs fail, and all of these things, he is still going to trust in God because of what he has learned about the nature of God. And I think that teaches us something as well, that as we begin to ask God these pertinent questions about life, about the goodness of God and the righteousness of God, and as God responds, we become afraid and fearful. We need to also remember that as sure as God is powerful and almighty, he is also interested in the salvation of his people, which can give us the confidence and courage that Habakkuk had, that we can, along with Habakkuk, we can continue to plead for mercy from God, and we can also rejoice in the God of our salvation. Thank you. I hope that this has been enlightening for you.